Come along with us as we explore the broad world of preservation and the work being done to preserve, interpret, and save our past in a 21st century world. From aquaculture to historic foodways to forensic modeling, we're talking weekly with experts from across the globe. This is your host, Nick Redding. Welcome to PreserveCast. Did you know that the Campaign for Historic Trades, which is powered by Preservation Maryland, is the sponsor of 3 registered apprenticeship programs? The campaign also hosts workshops across the nation, maybe even one in your backyard. Visit historictrades.org to learn more and find a way to learn a trade. This is Nick Redding. You're listening to PreserveCast. Today, I am thrilled to have not only a colleague but a friend join us today. Benjamin Takis, who is an attorney that I've known for many years now, and he's the founding attorney of Takis Nonprofit Law, which is a law firm that practices in the fields of tax, corporate governance, employment law, and business transactions for nonprofit organizations. And we're going to talk about why that matters to historic preservation and nonprofit groups here in a minute. Before we do that, just a reminder, if you're listening and you're enjoying this content or you think it's valuable for other folks to hear, please feel free to give it a share, jumping on social media and dropping a link to this show on your social feeds always helps a great deal in getting the news out about this show and the effort that we put into it. And then also make sure that you're subscribed and you're reviewing it. If you drop a couple stars on whatever platform you download us on, that goes a long way in helping make sure other people are aware of PreserveCast. So today we're going to be talking to Ben Takis about what would get someone involved in nonprofit law and what nonprofit law means and all that good stuff. But before we get there, we love to get to know the people that we're talking to. So, Ben, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up and what led you to the law? And then I suppose what led you to nonprofit law as a very particular specialty?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to talk about that. First of all, thank you for having me. I always enjoy when we get a chance to talk and nerd out on nonprofit stuff and tax law. Not very many people are interested in talking about that with me, so I'm always jump at the chance at that. So I grew up in New York, between Queens and Long Island, and I've kind of been going back and forth from New York to the D.C., Maryland area, then back to New York, kind of my whole life. So I grew up in New York, as I said. I went to university at George Washington University, D.C., of course. Went to law school in New York City at Cardozo School of Law. Cardozo seems to be on the rise a bit and was doing pretty well when I was there. I'm never sure how many people have heard of it. But then I came back to D.C. to actually practice law. And I've been back here since around 2006. So it's kind of back and forth. And then strangely, I never expected to get into nonprofits, not something I really had planned, but I knew I was always somebody who wanted to be in a niche. You know, I just feel more comfortable finding a specialty, especially if it's one where there are not already a ton of people. So at Cardozo, where I went to law school, that for some reason is full of people who are going into entertainment law, you know, music and film and all of that stuff, which is great. I was a music minor in school. I've been a semi-professional musician, even professional musician for a brief period of time. So on the surface, I'm very attracted to that kind of thing, and that would have been really cool. But the other side of me is like, no, there's a million people trying to do that. Go find something that not as many people are trying to do. So I found my way into tax law via employee benefits at first, believe it or not. So there's this whole area of law called ERISA, and it deals with the rules about 401k plans and pensions and healthcare benefits. And strangely, I just immersed myself in that. And I got into it, and I like a challenge, and kind of through that, I started taking every tax law class I could, because that's very related, and every employment law class I could. And that set me up to get a job, my first job as an attorney in DC with a firm called Bredoff and Kaiser. And their practice is representing big labor unions. So like AFL-CIO and steelworkers, great firm, great practice. And that was my initial exposure to nonprofits. Being their tax guy, I would do their employee benefit stuff, but then they'd also throw these nonprofit projects at me. And it was not very long, maybe a year or two into my practice, that I started falling in love with working with nonprofits and then getting a little bored of the grind of employee benefits, which is such a complex area and it changes so much every year. So it was a while of me trying to move my career in this direction where I could work just with nonprofits and kind of leave the employee benefits stuff behind. And eventually that led to me starting my own firm in 2012, to make a long story short.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's always interesting. I've heard you tell that story before. And, I think it's interesting how people kind of get into the things that they get into. And this is like an area where so many people need help. But it's interesting that you talk to a lot of attorneys and they're really not aware of sort of the intricacies of this. Or I think there's a sense that like, well, nonprofits that's just like a simple thing. You just create a nonprofit and then, it's not really like a business. And in reality, we sort of joke that it's like there are more rules for nonprofits than there are for any for-profit business. So you really have to know your way around the law in order to be careful about this and to be ethical and to meet the spirit and the regulations and all the things that are established, to make nonprofits work. So it's a critical part. I wanted to say first and foremost that because we're talking about the law today, just as a disclaimer, nothing that we're talking about or discussing today should be used or relied upon as legal advice. This is for informational purposes only, and you should always consult with a confident attorney if you're making any type of decision as it pertains to a nonprofit. This is more just to kind of talk about how this work is done and things that nonprofit folks should be thinking about and maybe talking to attorneys about.
Yeah, perfect. That's pretty much what I try to do when I give a disclaimer. So you covered it. But to your point,
Nick, go ahead.
I can kind of compare to my own journey, having my own practice and my own business. And I work as a solo attorney, which is kind of how I prefer it. I have some colleagues who they're fantastic at building out a team from scratch, and they like having employees under them. And me, I just kind of prefer to be in control of my little sphere. So I've been working for myself for a while. And I had no idea how that worked when I started. I had just worked as an employee, never started a business. And then I saved up about $5,000 and just say, okay, here, it's time to go. I arranged a little a business loan of or a line of credit of $15,000 and said to myself, okay, now it's time. I'm just going to start. And I left my job. And then I was just off trying to do my own thing. If this was a nonprofit that I was trying to do, I would never have been able to make it work. Just kind of building the plane while it's in the air, just kind of winging it, figuring stuff out as I go, trying to scrape by a living, and then occasionally building on that. Nonprofits are so much more complicated that it would never work without really thinking through all the aspects of it. As an attorney with a service-based business, that is simple enough that you can make that work. And there's lots of room for error and experimenting. Nonprofits, the margin is so much more thin. So I think that I always have looked at that experience as very illustrative of the challenges that nonprofits face.
Which is so funny, too, because like I was saying, there's this sense that it's simpler or that somehow it's less businesslike or, it's that it's just, and I think it's tied up in that whole, well, it's nonprofit. There's no profit associated with this. I mean, it's almost the word itself. And I was, we always kind of listeners know, some listeners know that we share some questions in advance to kind of get the conversation started and to give our guests a sense for understanding what we're going to be talking about, particularly when they're sort of complex issues like this. And the joke question I kind of threw in there is like, well, it's a nonprofit, so why is tax involved? I thought if there's no profit, there couldn't be tax, but obviously there's quite a bit. So maybe taking like a step back, how did the nonprofit world even begin? Because that's really the roots of that is kind of where all this comes from, right? That's why the IRS is involved, right? Is the fact that there is no, in theory, profit to inure the owners, or there are no owners. So where does this all come from? What is sort of the background on that?
At some point, I might have known the historic perspective. There is a great treatise by a legal writer and attorney, Bruce Hopkins. He has a whole line of treatises. And at the beginning of that, he goes into all of the history of where did the tax code start regulating nonprofits? Where did that all come from? And it's super interesting. I've read it a couple times. But in my day-to-day, I always flip past it. Okay, what is the answer I need right now? So it's been a little bit since I've read the history. But my understanding is, well, at a certain point, there appeared these provisions in the code to provide a tax exemption for charitable activities. I don't recall off the top of my head where those principles came from. There's probably an interesting historical story behind all that. But the reason the tax code became important for whatever reason is that there is a tax exemption with some benefits for people who want to donate. If it's a 501c3, you get the benefit, or the donors get the benefit of the charitable deduction. And that is a kind of public subsidy in a way. So as a policy matter, in exchange for this preferential tax treatment that has the ability to get donations that are eligible for the charitable deduction, we put these layers of parameters on what organizations can do and continue to qualify for it. So it all goes through the tax code, and it touches on a number of areas that go way beyond what corporations that are taxable think about when they're addressing tax issues, or partnerships, dealing with partnership tax. With nonprofits, as you know, Nick, it goes a lot more fundamentally to what is the organization doing? Is its mission worthy of tax-exempt status? Is it following all these conflict of interest rules? If it has business activities, does it have to pay tax on those? Because there are times when nonprofits do have to pay some taxes. So it kind of has all these issues and compliance considerations all built around maintaining that tax-exempt status and the advantages that come with it.
Yeah, it is seemingly simple, but it is very complex. And I think the complexity, personally, I always feel like it's more complex when you're trying to work backwards. Like it's always easier to, and that's just anything, right? But that'd be the same, probably taking an engine apart versus building one new. But it's always easier to do a better job when you start fresh and you are making good, wise, rational, legal decisions from the jump. And so the question I was going to have for you is, let's say you're starting a new, I mean, I guess these are two different things really, but if you were starting a new nonprofit, or you were coming in as the executive director, you've just been hired to run a nonprofit, what are the kinds of things that you should be thinking about? Because sometimes we don't know what we don't know, and that's where it can be challenging. What are some basic legal questions that you should be asking yourself, or bringing in an attorney to consider? How do you advise people on just what they should be thinking about generally? Are there sort of buckets that these concerns would fit into that people should be thinking about in order to be, prudent leaders of organizations?
Yeah. Well, the considerations are really different if it's a brand new organization versus somebody who's coming in to lead an existing organization and maybe need to revitalize it and maybe rethink the way things have been done. Those are very different scenarios that I encounter all the time in my practice. But when I'm talking to people who are starting a new organization or considering it and thinking through the possibilities, I like to get them to focus first on, well, what is nonprofit tax-exempt status going to get you? And are the benefits of that worth going down this very burdensome path of all these regulations and compliance issues and public transparency? So I think it's really fundamentally important to understand the reason you're seeking this status and what it's going to do for the organization and the goals that you have. And the benefits, just to break it down to fundamentals, if you're a 501c3, you get a tax exemption at a federal level. How that translates to state tax is a whole other question. Usually the corporate exemption follows either automatically or with a fairly easy application at the state level. Then there's state sales tax, state property tax, both real property and often tangible personal property. And you might or might not qualify for all those exemptions, even if you're 501c3. But just to keep it federal, first benefit is you get a tax exemption. But Nick, as you kind of hinted at, nonprofits, well, I encourage them and my colleagues, we all want organizations to be profitable. The nonprofit designation just means, what are you doing with those funds? In a for-profit, there's an owner who's pocketing them. In a nonprofit, you keep them in the organization and pursue the mission. So organizations...
And I just want to pause there because that is such a critical, I wish we could put that like on a bumper sticker or something because that is a big misnomer. Like you just very clearly and succinctly explained something that confuses a lot of people, that the goal is not to be unprofitable or to lose all your money.
Right.
The goal is to use that money that perhaps at the end of the year you have $1 extra, that you then reinvest that dollar in the work. And it's not going to, I guess the fancy word is inure, but the common sense would be it's not going to benefit one individual or a couple of owners or a group of owners or shareholders. Instead, it's going back into that charitable cause.
Right.
So, and I just think that's such an important kind of piece of the conversation. Yeah,
I think everybody who's works in any capacity with nonprofits will agree nonprofits need to be profitable, because you're not going to last very long if you're just constantly losing money or not having any kind of operating reserves, to kind of help you withstand some bumpy times. So the dollar of profit in your example, you could put that right into the mission, add to the programs, help more people. That's great. There's also a decision about, do we put that and build our operating reserves so we can more confidently look over a 10-year, 15-year horizon and tell our donors and our constituents, we're going to be around, donate to us with confidence, and we're not going to just shut down out of nowhere. So the more healthy an organization is with some operating reserves to provide a cushion, it will ultimately help the mission just as much. So there's a lot to talk about there with what to do with those extra funds if you're lucky enough and successful enough as an organization to bring them in. But absolutely, you need to be able to keep the lights on, number one.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of making that decision about, let's say that this group or the group has already been formed, they've already made that decision. The challenges outweigh the benefits rather outweigh all the challenges. So we're going to become a nonprofit. Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess, are there different buckets of things that they should just be thinking about when it is that they need to talk to an attorney? Because obviously the whole point of having you here is to point out that this is a specialized part of law. We're not giving that advice today. You can't do that over a podcast. There's no possible way we could provide that. But it's just sort of like a lot of things that we do to sort of illuminate that this is one aspect of, in this case, the work of a historic preservation organization.
Yeah.
Many preservation organizations are nonprofits, and in order to accomplish this work, they have to think through this process. So, what are those decision points when you would say either the things that they should be thinking about, after they've made that decision, or the places where it's like, this is the time when you really, really should be thinking about going and seeking out some legal advice?
Yeah. So I think it's helpful to at least get the perspective of an attorney as early on in the process as possible. And it's a bit self-interested to say that, but I don't say that looking for clients. I just say that based on seeing a lot of people with very strange views of what you can do and can't do based on, well, I heard this person over here did this and I must be able to do that. Nick, we talk about that kind of thing a lot, which happens with nonprofits often. And you'd be surprised at the amount of kind of strange ideas that people get in their head. So it's important to get some kind of perspective, whether you pay a bunch of money for an attorney to help you through every step, or you just get a consultation, or you get access to pro bono help. All that is great, but the more perspectives on that as early as possible, the better. And that goes also with accountants who are well versed in nonprofits. Their perspective is a little different, but also super important. So I think as early in the process, getting that kind of input is helpful. But if I may, I was saying the first thing I want people to understand: why are you seeking tax-exempt status, and the benefits of that? There's the tax exemption, and that the benefit of that kind of depends on, well, how much quote unquote profit are you going to have? Because the tax exemption only really benefits you if you've got large excess earnings or excess revenue. The other benefit is you get the ability to receive tax-deductible donations as a 501c3. Okay, that's helpful. But Nick, I'm not sure how many high-dollar donors you're talking to. But day to day, not necessarily the number one thing guiding most donors, the ability to use the charitable deduction, unless you get into like people with a lot of money that they really want that tax break.
Yeah,
so
and
I
I
wouldn't
think
put
that
too much
there's
importance in that one.
Yeah, and just as sort of a comment on that one is that I think that fundraising research suggests that people give because they care about the cause, not because of what they get in return. Whether that be
right.
a little book, or whether that even be the charitable deduction, that happens to be a nice side, sort of benefit. And I think it sometimes is part of the calculation, particularly when it comes to maybe structuring a gift because of a retirement account or something like that, or needing to do something like that. But generally speaking, people give because they're passionate about a cause.
Right. The other benefit that's like concrete is that it unlocks a whole lot of possibilities for grant funding, specifically for or grant funding from private foundations, certain government grants, which you're just practically speaking not going to get if you're not a 501c3 or at least a tax-exempt organization. So those are kind of the three concrete benefits. But another reason that in some ways kind of overrides them all is for some types of organizations, it just feels strange and maybe a little shady to be doing what you're doing without tax-exempt status, 501c3 status. So maybe just as a perception and a public relations, you need that benefit just to go out being in the community, doing what you're doing with kind of some level of trust. So those are the reasons. I think it's important to think those through. And then in terms of legal considerations, once you've got a handle on that, it is thinking, well, what type of organization are we? Is 501c3 status appropriate? Is it possible, given what our mission and our activities are? Is there some other type of entity, like a 501c4 lobbying kind of organization or a 501c6 trade association? There are different types of nonprofits with different classifications and different mission areas and activities. So thinking through what type of organization we are, what would serve us best, And then within those categories, like with historic preservation, what are the special issues raised by the type of organization that we are? So I think that is very important, getting to know where are these touch points where they're just tough issues to grapple with. And in historic preservation, Nick, we often talk about, okay, there's a project that would be really nice to help support and raise money for, but there's private owners, but the public also benefits from it. So navigating these issues, this one's called the private benefit rule. I know Nick knows this very well. But with historic preservation specifically, you will over and over again be confronted with issues in that area. And it's similar for other types of organizations. They have their own issues. So it's important to get to know that, I think.
Yeah, and just as in full disclosure, I'm familiar with it because I do a good job of making sure that we're always on the right side of the law. Not familiar with it because anything's gone wrong, Ben.
Oh, okay, yes.
And because we have good legal counsel.
Yes.
So, yeah, and I mean, I oftentimes think about it, too, in the context, so not only of the work that you're doing, but the people who are helping you do that work. So who you're working with and how your board supports that work, and making sure that you have robust and best practices for your board, whether that be through your bylaws, through your conflict of interest policies. There's a whole host of sort of supporting documents that we have a titanic volume of all of our different policies that make the organization run. And of course, we're an organization that has employees, so there's a whole other part of law that you get into once you go down that road. But even just the basics of conflict of interest and making sure that your board is operating within a framework that is acceptable not only to the IRS, but to whatever state you're in. So there are a host of different considerations that you go through. And, Ben is being very modest about not looking for clients, and nor does he really need to. But we will have a link to his contact information in the show notes here, so that you can reach out to him if you're sort of in the greater DC metro area. That's sort of his practice area. But there are people all across the country. If you look for this, it's just a specialty that you have to kind of seek out, because as Ben mentioned up front, it is sort of niche in a way. It's a specialized version of the practice of law. I'm curious, though, too. I know that you have helped and really been engaged and co-founded some work in this area. Are there places online that people can look so that before they even go to talk to an attorney, they know the questions to ask or the things that they should be thinking about? Are there resources online you would point people towards?
Yeah, well, this is a good opportunity to plug an educational site that I maintain with a colleague of mine who's a CPA. So we call it Sustainability Education for Nonprofits, the number 4. That's my colleague's idea from his consulting business, kind of ties in with that. And the URL is se4nonprofits.com, se4nonprofits.com. And we started that up in 2020 as the pandemic was hitting organizations and people were scrambling and trying to understand and navigate and stay alive financially. So we started putting all of our content on a weekly basis at first, every couple times per week on that site. And we've been doing it pretty consistently over this time. So really, there's a ton of stuff, pieces by me, pieces by my colleague, video content, resources like template documents. Some of that is behind a paywall, but most of the stuff on the site is open for everybody. So I would encourage people to check that out. Been kind of putting all my accumulated wisdom, whatever there is, on that site over the years.
Yeah, and that's a good place to kind of check in. And there's, that links out to other places too, I know, where you've identified other resources and things like that. And it's a good place to start just in terms of like, if you're just trying to get a lay of the land of like, okay, here's the issues we should be thinking about. And obviously we talk to a lot of, a lot of listeners of PreserveCast are engaged in nonprofit work. Maybe they serve on a board, or they actually work for a nonprofit, or they perhaps even lead a nonprofit, because, this work, sort of like you were saying at the public relations side, so much of preservation is done by community nonprofits, or it's advocated for by community nonprofits, which leads me to another question. So this is sort of an example of some of these strange ideas that just don't seem to die out there.
Yeah.
Ben, I heard that nonprofits can't do any advocacy. Is that true?
Not quite. Yeah. So first, it kind of depends on what kind of nonprofit you are.
Right.
And then second, it depends on what you mean by advocacy.
Okay, so take us down this road. I know you and I have talked about this extensively, and not just for ourselves, but in front of other groups as well. There is this persistent myth that all advocacy is not allowed for nonprofits, and that's not the case. There are some guidelines around it, but nonprofits can do advocacy when they meet certain guidelines. What are those, broadly speaking?
Yeah, well, if we're talking about 501c3 public charities, there are limits on how much, quote unquote, lobbying a 501c3 public charity can do. And there's a total prohibition on political campaign activities for 501c3 organizations. Now, where things get a little tricky is to distinguish what is lobbying that is subject to the limits versus what is some kind of broader notion of advocacy that an organization can do, but doesn't kind of fall within those statutory limits. And then there's tricky things about, well, what counts as political campaign activity versus getting out there and talking about issues that may be relevant to a political campaign, but are not taking a position one way or the other on a specific candidate. So all those are tricky legal issues. But I think the key thing first is to distinguish between lobbying under the tax code and this broader notion of advocacy. And then to keep in mind, even if you're doing some quote unquote lobbying as a 501c3 nonprofit organization, that is not prohibited. That is just subject to limits. So you need to be thinking about how much you're doing and keeping track of employee time and direct expenses in connection with lobbying activities, but you're not prohibited from doing those. Now, if you're a 501c3 private foundation, that's a little different because they are not allowed to lobby. But most of your audience, I would think it's 501c3 public charities. So it is permitted, possibly subject to limits, but to a large degree, not even necessarily subject to limits. So I'll give you the definition. So we'll do a little bit of more precise law. Lobbying, there's two types. There's direct lobbying, which is talking to legislators and their staffers about the formulation of law, that kind of thing, generally counts as direct lobbying. If you're making known your organization's position on a piece of proposed legislation or a proposed amendment or something like that, that's probably going to be direct lobbying. There's also this notion of grassroots lobbying, which is your communications as an organization with the general public. However, it only counts as grassroots lobbying if there's a reference to specific legislation, you express your organization's position on that legislation, and importantly, there is some call to action, meaning some reference to contacting your senator or your congressperson and tell them how you feel about this proposed legislation or existing legislation or something like that. So if you're not within, in hitting all three of those elements of the law, you are not engaged in grassroots lobbying, or direct lobbying on the other side. And that opens up a whole realm of activity that a nonprofit can do without even worrying about the limits. So, for example, if you're out there talking about regulations, you think they should be adjusted to work a certain different way, or you think there are certain regulations that should be repealed, or maybe certain regulations are needed, but you're not talking about legislative activities or changes in the law, that is generally not considered lobbying unless there's some circumstance where there's some pending legislation that is relevant. So all of that, as a general matter, would be outside of the limits, which opens up a whole realm of activity that you can do. So let me stop here.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I think it's super helpful. And I think that, we're obviously not going to be able to get into every last detail of advocacy. And part of this is to point out that there are nuances to this sort of thing. So it's important to dig into that. And whether or not some people, you hear somebody say something is or isn't allowed, to dig in a little bit further, because sometimes the truth, oftentimes the truth is a little bit more complex than that blanket statement. So in this case, no, it's not true that nonprofits can't do any advocacy, but nonprofits are prevented from doing certain types, but are free to have a much freer hand to do other types. So like what you're talking about there, and then, there being a boundary line on how much time you can spend on direct or versus the grassroots, and really just being very thoughtful about this kind of work as well. And I think that if there were one takeaway I would want people, and I'm curious what you would want, but mine would be just to be thoughtful about it, to sort of think through your work and how that may impact your nonprofit status, and making sure that you're always being very careful to sort of check in with the law from time to time to make sure that you're being both ethical and meeting the spirit of the regulation. I guess that's sort of what this conversation is supposed to spark, is an interest in those finer details, because this is not simple stuff.
Yeah, and I would give a very concrete takeaway. I'll go in a different direction. If your organization is thinking about doing advocacy or expanding those efforts, look into what we call the 501H election. I might get the form wrong, but because I always mess up these numbers off the top of my head, but I think it's Form 8976. Again, apologies if I remember that wrong. But that is an election that you can make to have your lobbying activities measured solely based on expenditures, which includes allocation of staff time. And if basically the idea is that gives you a lot more certainty about where you are within the limits of the test and what you can do and what you can't. And it is usually more favorable, unless you're a really giant organization that you would be kind of capped out at what the 501H limits allow. But that's one practical takeaway. If you're engaged with this at all, look into that, think about whether that makes sense, and that will give you a lot more certainty about where you are within these tests.
Is there a way, I'm curious, for someone listening who's like, oh boy, I've never really thought to sit down and talk to a nonprofit law attorney, it might be time for us to just check in. Do you engage with, or do other attorneys, not just you, because this isn't a sales pitch just for Takis Law, but just sort of more broadly a conversation about it. But do you ever encounter groups that just say, I want you to take a look at the work and just make sure we're meeting all the standards? Is that something that can be done if people don't know what they don't know?
That's I love how you phrase that, because it sounds so simple. Just take a look and make sure we're meeting all the standards. People do ask me those questions. So what I try to do is help people kind of formulate, flesh out what is the issue. And that kind of goes back to my law school training, spotting issues, kind of separating them out. Okay, what needs to be addressed? What is more urgent? So that's one thing that I work with clients on. But sometimes, a lot of the times, nonprofits approach me with a very specific thing that they need help with. Other times, what I do occasionally is just kind of do a paid consultation where we sit down, let's book out an hour, and let's just go through individualized. Let's talk through all the questions you have. I can flag the issues that I'm hearing as we're talking, and that can hopefully give you a better sense, because the first step is really, okay, what are the issues that I need to have on my radar? What are the right questions to be asking? And then it's another step from there, figuring out what do we drill down on? Where do we really need to invest this part of our budget to get this more certainty and make sure we're really on the right side of things versus what is just something to have on our radar and have in our mind so that we're more thoughtful about our activities and the way we're spending funds and what we're doing with them. So
Yeah.
does that make
No.
sense?
Yeah, I think that that's really helpful. I think that it kind of gives people a sense for like what they should be thinking about. Or if they're like, you know what, we do a lot of advocacy and we just want to make sure that we're doing this the right way. That might be the question. Or,
Oh, sure,
we're, to a certain type of group that engages in a certain activity and want to make sure that we're abiding by any new guidelines that have been propagated with respect to that, or new new private letter rulings, which is a whole other thing that we won't talk about today. But if you dig in with any attorney worth their salt, then you'll definitely probably get a little bit of that.
Yeah.
So before we're kind of drawn to a conclusion here, but before we go, a couple other questions. Is there one like thing, I'm sure a lot of preservationists, if you said, oh, is there one thing that people do to historic structures that drives you nuts, you wish you could stop? Most of them will be able to point something out, Portland cement or something like that. But Is there one legal misstep you see nonprofits engage in that you wish people just, oh, please don't do that, or you should know better, or I wish you would avoid that?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind may be counterintuitive because it's not specifically legal, but getting your accounting house in order, having good financial records. I just, from experience and working in this field for a long time, that is usually the first sign of things going wrong, is that the financial records are a mess. So it's kind of the foundation on which everything else is built, because so much of compliance with nonprofit law requires good accounting, good record keeping. Back to the lobbying question, if you're not accurately tracking staff time, and having good practices around timesheets, you're not going to know what is the right way to allocate, and apply these limits. It also goes to if you're receiving donations that are restricted for a specific purpose, you've got restricted funds, you've got to know how to account for those and be able to show that money you received, you only spent for this purpose. Whereas there's other money that you know how to track and make, might have some more flexibility around it. And I could go on and on about the ways that record keeping, financial record keeping and accounting provides the basis for compliance with all of these legal requirements. But that is almost where I would start for an organization.
That's interesting. I'm sure your CPA friend would be appreciative of you pointing that out, and obviously it makes sense now why an attorney and a CPA would talk about sustainability for nonprofits, because there are two parts of the or two sides to the same coin. In order to have a strong legal footing, you need to know where it came from and where it's supposed to go, at the very least. And that's an interesting take on that. So before we go, Ben, here's a question I've never asked you, and have never had to pay for the answer to this one. What is your favorite historic place or site?
Okay, well, for me personally, my wife and I have always loved the Lincoln Memorial. That just since the time we met, and that has always been a place that we get a lot from just being there and taking it in. So honestly, that's probably the answer. But I almost feel compelled to talk about this personal story, which I very rarely, have something in my life personally that interacts with historic preservation. So can I tell that real quick, Nick?
Absolutely.
So there's a bit of a long story, but I'll make it short. My stepfather, he's still alive. He had a career in music, and I've been working with him on his catalog of music over the years. And he had been signed to some record labels, and that's a whole long story. But he grew up in this city called Huntington on Long Island in New York. And his childhood home happens to be a historic property on Long Island in Huntington. It goes back to 1864 in his family. It was owned by a man named Peter Crippen, who was a free black man who traveled from Virginia to settle on Long Island around the time when Virginia has been changing its laws, I understand. And if you were free, either through one of the laws that where slaves were set free, or you were born as a free man or person, it was time to get out of Virginia. So there was a whole influx of people from Virginia settling on Long Island. He bought this property in Huntington in 1864, one of the very few pieces of property that were owned by a free black man on Long Island in that area, and also happens to be the site of possibly the oldest grist mill in the country, which I believe goes back to the 1650s. So I hear from the historic preservation people that was a big deal. And there was a whole ongoing saga about how my stepfather sold that to the town, and they kind of did an archaeological dig on the site. They're building out an African-American museum in Huntington. And after a bunch of years, they tore down the site, which was collapsing and like really in bad shape. And they're going to rebuild it as part of the museum. And where this became personally interesting to me is that my stepfather had a bunch of his tapes from his music career inside this collapsing house. And the people involved were great. They understood the historic importance of that. And we were there on site. There was a whole press conference. And I got to see these people do their work about very meticulously taking down this property and being very, very mindful of anything they found that might have some historical significance, and then taking down piece by piece. So that was really fascinating for me, kind of seeing that side of it after working with historic preservation organizations and advising on the law. I kind of got to see more of what you all do when you're actually dealing with history and with this kind of property.
Yeah, what a fascinating. You mentioned that story before, and I think you sent some pictures over when it was happening, and and I think what's so powerful about all of this is that preservation in history can feel like one thing when it's just sort of a broad retelling of a story, but when it becomes personal, it takes on a different flavor and just a different level of importance. And that's, I think, what a lot of preservationists kind of try and bring to these situations is sort of an understanding and awareness that, this is somebody's story. And so there's a great weight associated with that. And and we'll have to, I mentioned to Ben at the time, once this is up and running, we would love to bring them on and have the conversation and bring this story full circle from your intro as a favorite historic place to what's being done there today in Huntington. Well, Ben, this has been a pleasure to sit down and provide informational advice only, as we said, but sort of a little bit of a sort of a coming attractions for things you should be thinking about if you're engaged in nonprofit work and how that relates to the law. Ben gave us a lot to chew on. We'll make sure there's a link not only in the show notes to his website, but also to the Sustainability for Nonprofits website that he mentioned, and we'll have all that and more in the show notes. Ben, thanks so much for joining us and for all your good work and keeping us on the right side of the law.
Anytime. It's my pleasure.
PreserveCast is recorded in Maryland and is powered by Preservation Maryland, a nonprofit organization headquartered in Baltimore, Maryland. Since 2017, the podcast has told stories from around the world about how people are documenting, caring for, and interpreting the past. If you want to support this effort, please visit preservecast.org to learn more and keep on preserving.